we have coming to us from the Bellwether Education Partners, Chad Alderman and Carolyn Chong. They'll present the Bellwether Report, Teacher Evaluations in an Era of Rapid Change. Mr. Alderman is an associate partner at Bellwether Education Partners, where he has worked on the policy and thought leadership team since 2012, advising clients in writing on teacher pensions, teacher preparation and evaluation, and college and career readiness. Previously, Chad was a policy advisor in the Office of Planning, Evaluation, and Policy Development at the U.S. Department of Education, where he worked on ESEA waivers, teacher preparation, and the Teacher Incentive Fund. Prior to joining the department, Chad was a policy analyst with Education Sector. Carolyn Chong is an analyst with Bellwether Education Partners in the policy and thought leadership practice area as well. Since joining in 2014, Carolyn has worked on education policy analysis projects with nonprofit organizations and foundations. Prior to joining Bellwether, Carolyn was at Mathematica Policy Research, evaluating the effectiveness of various social policies related to education reform and global development. Let's hear from Chad and Carolyn.
Hi, this is Chad Ullman from Bellwether. I'll just say a little bit about Bellwether so you all have a little more information about us. We're a national nonprofit dedicated to helping education organizations become more effective in their work with high-need students. Our organization has a combination of 3 different teams working on these issues: strategic advising, talent services, and policy and thought leadership. Carolyn and I work on the policy and thought leadership team, where we conduct policy analysis, research, writing, and idea generation. And we're going to join you today. Carolyn and I co-wrote a paper in August called Teacher Evaluations in an Era of Rapid Change, from Unsatisfactory to Needs Improvement. So that title is a little bit cheeky, but we really think it conveys some of the information about our work as well, that we do see some improvements in state and district evaluation systems, but there's still lots of work to be done, as I'm sure you're all aware. So today we're going to talk about the findings from teacher evaluation and the early implementation efforts. We won't be able to get through everything that we learned, so there is a link at the end of our presentation if you're interested in the full paper. We also have an appendix for all of our data sources. If you're interested in particular state sources of information, there's more there at the end of the document. So the basic premise, as Dan mentioned, that states have made substantive sweeping changes to teacher evaluation and principal evaluation and personnel policies beginning in 2010, driven by Race to the Top and the ESEA waiver initiatives. After these policy reforms, though, it's turned into the implementation phase, and that has struggled and sometimes bogged down over smaller decisions or delays or pilots or things like that. So to examine those implementation efforts and challenges, we collected data from 17 states and the District of Columbia that had released information about their new evaluation systems. To the extent possible, we looked at all the different forms of information that they released, so summative evaluation ratings as well as the sub-component evaluation ratings for student growth or qualitative observations or other components of the system as well. So we're going to present a few slides and showing some of the summary findings from those states that we looked at. And I'm going to pop out some of the slides to show you a little bit bigger so you can get the sense of the graphs that we have. This first one is looking at Louisiana. And what we found is that districts are beginning to evaluate teachers as professionals, not just interchangeable widgets. And the widgets term, again, comes from the report that Dan cited from the TNTP called the widget effect. And in 2010, 2011, Louisiana more or less treated teachers as widgets. 99% received satisfactory ratings and 1% received unsatisfactory ratings. They've now moved to a more multi-tiered evaluation system where they rate teachers and other professionals, educators, on a 4-scale system. And they're starting to see some differentiation. As Dan mentioned, if you look only at the unsatisfactory category, they've changed the terms. But even if you look only at that one category, it's changed from 1% a few years ago to 4% in the most recent data that we have. So we don't think that's necessarily the full way to look at it. I think that it's important, as Dan mentioned, to see the gradations here, that there are now districts in Louisiana can say that 32% of their teachers are highly effective, as opposed to 99% are just satisfactory. They can make different decisions attached to those. Similarly, Louisiana districts have now put 2,000 educators on notice that they need to improve their practice, and that they are at risk now under Louisiana's new system of losing their job if they don't improve their performance over time. They've also created more categories to give teachers better feedback on their performance and give teachers some direction about what they can improve on going forward. The last thing I'll point out is just the terms that we now use to describe educator effectiveness. So we've moved from a binary system where we talked about only in terms of satisfactory, unsatisfactory, which are relatively black and white terms, to now where we use more descriptive terms like highly effective or ineffective or effective, proficient, effective, emerging. And we saw this in other states as well. I'll turn it over to Carolyn to talk about the other findings.
Hi everyone, this is Carolyn Chung. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I am going to jump in now and walk us through the next few slides. So I first want to review some of our findings around classroom observations. There's been a lot of discussion over the last few years around student growth and the use of value-added metrics, and that can make it easy to forget about the importance of classroom observations. But this type of data remains valuable because it provides teachers with qualitative feedback so that they can make real-time changes to their practice. So through our research, our first finding was that states have increased the frequency of observations. In a relatively short time period between 2009 and 2013, the number of states requiring annual evaluations for all teachers increased from 15 to 28. And there are several states now that actually require more than one observation a year. And that's very, very crucial for creating a culture of continuous improvement. We also found that districts and states are starting to adopt evidence-backed rubrics that require more detailed observations of a teacher's practice in a classroom. And that's a big change from how things were before, when a lot of districts were using homegrown checklists. One rubric that several states and districts have started to adopt is the Charlotte-Danielson framework. However, an area of concern for us is that we're starting to learn about how observations can be biased against teachers serving high-need students. The Brookings Institution released a study earlier this year that found that teachers serving higher performing students tended to receive better observation scores. So if you haven't seen that report, I encourage you to check it out. So I talked a little bit about classroom observations, and even with the more frequent use of observations and the use of evidence-based rubrics, I think it's still important to understand how student academic performance affects teacher evaluation ratings. After reviewing the policies and data of multiple states, we found that there was a discrepancy between student learning results and a teacher's overall rating. And this figure shows you specifically how this disconnect plays out in Delaware. This data is was released from Delaware's first year of their pilot evaluation system. That was in 2012-13. And the top line, the blue line, shows you the percentage of teachers who received satisfactory ratings on all qualitative components of their evaluation, whereas the bottom line, the red line, shows you the percentage of students meeting growth targets on the statewide math exam. And this shows you the results for all of the districts in Delaware, and you can see that across every single district in Delaware, there's a disconnect there, and that's concerning for us because the end outcome is that teachers likely end up receiving inflated ratings that don't indicate how much they actually influence student learning. I now want to turn to another implementation issue we surfaced while carrying out our research. A lot of the pushback against teacher evaluation reform has been around the loss of local control under new statewide evaluation systems. We found that we don't actually see evidence that points to one-size-fits-all policies that in any way hurt district control. This figure here shows you 3 neighboring counties in Florida, and it shows you their recent evaluation ratings that they released for their teachers. And you can see that the distribution of teacher effectiveness varies wildly across these 3 districts. And interestingly, these 3 districts have very similar percentages of low-income students and also very similar performance on statewide assessments. So you would expect teacher effectiveness to be more similar than they are across the 3 districts. And it's not completely, out of the realm of possibility that teacher effectiveness does vary that much within these 3 districts, but I think the data here really does raise questions. And if you read our report, this just shows you an example from Florida, but if you read our report, you can learn more about other states that have large inconsistencies with their teacher evaluation ratings. I'm going to turn it back over to Chad.
Yeah, so our 5th finding was that districts are still not yet making decisions about teachers based on their performance. Part of this is based on the evaluation systems themselves, that they took some time to implement them, and in many places those are still in the process, either through pilots or non-consequential years or other things. But the performance component is delayed even beyond that. This graph that you see is looking at pay incentives, and it's a couple years old now, but it's looking at the national lens. It's from the National Schools and Staffing Survey, and it looks at, over time, how have districts changed the way they compensate their educators. And there aren't a lot of districts using pay, one of their few tools to retain and attract teachers, as a method to either attract based on performance or even based on shortage areas. So the far right bar looks at the percentage of districts that use pay incentives to reward or retain teachers in fields or schools that are shortage areas that need it. We also looked, one of the things that I think has gone under the radar is that states have often changed their laws about the potential consequences for new evaluation results. And so now districts can use performance to drive layoff decisions, or they can use it to drive compensation decisions, or they can use it to drive dismissal decisions. Often those are few and far between, and the concerns about widespread dismissals based on new evaluation systems is really not evident in many places. So when we looked in certain states, there aren't many examples of widespread use of that. Jackie, can you help us? I'm not sure how to make it so it's not popped out anymore. There we go. So finally, I want to conclude with some lessons we have from early findings around teacher evaluation reform. And the first thing I want to say is just that there's good evidence now and growing evidence that from cities like Denver and Cincinnati and Washington, D.C. and New York City, that comprehensive evaluation reform efforts are worth making, that they can help teachers improve their practice, can help districts boost their recruitment and retention efforts of high-quality educators, and it can, in turn, over time, boost student achievement. So as these evaluation systems continue to develop and implement, we think there's a lot of room for tracking the development and tracking the improvements. And so just the first thing is tracking the data. So someone mentioned earlier about the comments about how the summative evaluation rating is often what people pay attention to. And that is true. A lot of times that's what states are reporting. But there are instances of districts and states tracking the subcomponent measures as well. And we think it's really important for states and districts to continue that and to look at how these are playing out in terms of equity for different types of educators, in terms of different subjects that they teach, grades that they teach, or even schools or districts. The reforms are taking time to implement, and we think that's a good thing, but also shouldn't be necessarily delayed out of politics or other concerns. I think that it's important that people see these evaluation systems as a method for continuous improvement. They're not going to be perfect on day one, and they should be phased in and improved over time. And we continue to need more research on the validity and reliability of all parts of the new evaluation systems. Just to reiterate something that Carolyn mentioned is that there is worrisome concern that even the observation ratings that teachers receive are biased based on the students they educate. There may be ways to address that, but if we don't track the information, we won't know. So with that, I'll conclude and just point you to our report. It's on our website at bellwethereducation.org, and happy to get into some questions. I'll turn it over back to Tammy and Jackie.
Great. Thank you, Chad and Carolyn, for sharing some of the recent results on the implementation and outcomes of new educator evaluation systems. This is Liz Barkowski. I'm a research associate here with the REL Southwest. And I think Carolyn and Chad provide a lot of evidence of variation in implementation and results of new educator evaluation systems. So Ohio is going to share their experiences next, but before we dive into their presentation, we'd like to hear from you about the challenges that you've encountered when implementing new educator evaluation systems and how you've thought about overcoming those challenges. If you could type your comments and your responses in the chat pod, we'll give you a couple minutes here to respond, and then we'll hear about Ohio's experiences in implementing a new statewide educator evaluation system. So again, what challenges have you encountered as a practitioner, as a State Department of Education staff member, as a school district staff member, as a teacher or principal, as a researcher or technical assistance provider in working with states and districts on the implementation and design of these new systems? What are some major challenges that you've encountered in either design or implementation, and do you have any thoughts on how you might overcome those challenges? It sounds like a lot of people are in the pilot stages of implementing these new systems as well, based on the poll that we posed prior to Chad and Carolyn's presentation. So if you've had challenges in pilot phase or even in full implementation and trying to roll out a state system. Looks like we have a few comments coming here. I can say that I know here in Texas, we currently started the pilot stage of the new system here in the state, and I imagine that the state will encounter some challenges when rolling out statewide. Sounds like Kelly has indicated trying to encourage schools and districts to balance the various pieces of information that go into the evaluation and not over-rely on one. So that speaks sort of to Dan's point made earlier, and also what Carolyn and Chad reiterated, that some districts and states may include student growth as a measure, but that's not necessarily what districts and school administrators even use to inform various human capital management decisions they're making about teachers. It sounds like Florida districts can set their own cut scores to differentiate among 4 summative ratings, so they can set their own scores that indicates which rating category a teacher will fall into. And that's definitely a reason for that variation, or could be a potential reason for that variation that Chad and Carolyn showed earlier in their slides. It sounds like this is the case for the observation system as well as the value-added data. It sounds like also that Hella has indicated that educators don't necessarily have assessments in place that are appropriate to use as part of their evaluations. I know that's specifically the case in the non-tested grades and subjects, particularly with student learning objectives or other measures. And it sounds like a lot of states, or as Helen mentioned, states and districts are working to develop or identify new assessments to use as indicators of student growth. Great, so we encourage you to continue to type your comments in the chat as we go along. And I'd like to turn it back over to Tammy to introduce our Ohio.